Have you ever wondered what happens after the storybook ending crumbles? For 15 years, Sophia Reynolds believed she had it all: a loving husband, a beautiful home, a life built on shared dreams. But one rainy Tuesday, her husband Julian shattered that reality. He was leaving her. For a younger woman from his office, a woman with more ambition and less history. Julian traded their comfortable life for a future of passion and excitement, leaving Sophia with nothing but memories and a broken heart. He thought he was upgrading. He thought he'd never look back. But 5 years later, at the most exclusive charity gala of the year, he saw her again. And the man who threw everything away suddenly found himself with nothing to say. The scent of roasted rosemary and garlic chicken, Julian's favorite, did little to warm the sterile silence of their dining room. Sophia Reynolds had spent the better part of the afternoon perfecting the meal, a subconscious peace offering for a war she didn't realize had already been lost. 15 years of marriage had taught her the rhythms of Julian Vance's moods. The slight clench in his jaw, the way his eyes would scan a room without ever truly seeing it. The perfunctory kiss he'd place on her cheek when he came home from the architectural firm, smelling of expensive cologne and a faint, unplaceable distance. Tonight, all the warning signs were blaring. Their home in the Boston suburbs, a meticulously restored Victorian they had once poured their hearts and savings into, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a museum of a life that was once vibrant. The photographs on the mantelpiece showed a younger, happier couple grinning on a gondola in Venice, bundled in ski gear in Aspen, their arms wrapped around each other at a company picnic just a few years prior. Looking at them now felt like observing the fossilized remains of an extinct species. "The Henderson Project is proving to be a nightmare," Julian said, pushing a perfectly roasted potato around his plate with his fork. It was the first thing he'd said in 10 minutes. His voice, once the sound that could soothe any of her anxieties, now felt like a stranger's. "Oh, what's the issue?" Sophia asked, her own fork frozen mid-air. She tried to infuse her tone with genuine interest, the wifely duty she had perfected over a decade and a half. She had set aside her own promising career as an art historian to support his ascent at Sterling and Vance Architects, a sacrifice she had made willingly, believing they were a team. "It's Chloe," he sighed, and the way he said the name, a soft, almost involuntary caress of the syllables, sent a sliver of ice down Sophia's spine. Chloe Summers, the new junior architect. Young, raven-haired, with a predatory ambition that Sophia had clocked from the moment she'd met her at the last company holiday party. Chloe had hung on Julian's every word, her laughter a little too loud, her touch on his arm lingering a fraction of a second too long. Sophia had dismissed it as the naivete of a subordinate trying to impress the boss. She had been a fool. "She's just so driven." Julian continued, oblivious to the sudden chill in the room. "She has these radical ideas for the atrium that the board thinks are too risky, but I see the genius in them. She's not afraid to break the rules." The unspoken addendum hung heavy in the air, "unlike you." Sophia felt the familiar bitter sting. For years, Julian's compliments had become backhanded critiques. Her steady, thoughtful nature was now unadventurous. Her love for their quiet life was stagnation. Her loyalty was predictability. He was painting her in shades of beige, while apparently this Chloe was a supernova of vibrant color. "Well, sometimes rules are there for a reason, Julian. To prevent costly mistakes," Sophia said, her voice tighter than she intended. He finally looked at her, truly looked at her, and his eyes were cold. "That's the difference between us, Sophia. You see rules. She sees possibilities. You see a fence. She sees a horizon." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was using his professional life as a metaphor to assassinate their personal one. Each word was a calculated blow designed to make her feel small, antiquated, and utterly insufficient. She put her fork down, her appetite completely gone. The delicious meal she had prepared now felt like ashes in her mouth. "What is this really about, Julian?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question felt momentous, like pushing a loose rock at the edge of a cliff. She knew with a dreadful certainty that an avalanche was coming. He took a long, slow sip of his Cabernet, his gaze unwavering. He didn't flinch. He didn't have the decency to look ashamed. He looked relieved, as if he had been waiting for her to finally ask the question he didn't have the courage to voice first. "I'm leaving you, Sophia," he said. The words were simple, declarative, and utterly devastating. They landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow knocking the air from her lungs. "You're... what?" She heard the words come out of her mouth, but they sounded distant, foreign. A ringing started in her ears. "I've found someone else," he continued, his voice gaining a chilling resolve. "I've found life again. Passion. I've been dead for years and I didn't even know it." "Dead," she echoed, her heart fracturing with each syllable. "We built a life together. This house, our friends, our history. Was all of that death to you?" "It was comfortable," he corrected, as if that were the most damning word in the dictionary. "It was predictable. I need more. Chloe, she offers more. She sees the man I can be, not the man I've settled into being." The name again. Chloe. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a wrecking ball. The affair hadn't just been in her imagination. It had been happening under her nose in the late nights at the office he claimed were for deadlines in the business trips that had become more frequent. She felt a wave of nausea. "So, you're just throwing it all away." 15 years. For a junior architect who has been at the firm for 6 months? Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed dam of her composure finally breaking. "Don't reduce her to that," he snapped, a flash of anger in his eyes. He was defending her. Already. "You don't know her. You don't know us." "I know you, Julian," she whispered, tears now streaming down her face, hot and furious. "Or at least I thought I did. The man I knew wouldn't do this. He wouldn't be this cruel." He stood up from the table, scraping his chair back against the hardwood floor. The sound was violent, grating. He tossed his napkin onto his barely touched plate of food, a final act of dismissal. A dismissal of the meal, of her, of their entire life together. "I've already packed a bag. I'll be staying at a hotel until we can sort things out with the lawyers," he said, his voice now brisk and businesslike. He was already detaching, already moving on. "My lawyer, Robert Peterson, will be in touch with you tomorrow to discuss the arrangements." He walked out of the dining room without a backward glance. Sophia sat there frozen, listening to his footsteps on the stairs, the zip of a suitcase, the click of the front door closing. The silence that descended was absolute, a heavy shroud smothering the last vestiges of her life as she knew it. She looked at the 2 plates of food, the 2 glasses of wine, the 2 empty chairs. A perfect portrait of a partnership now irrevocably shattered. The Last Supper was over, and she had eaten it alone. The days that followed the front door clicking shut were a blur of gray monotony, punctuated by sharp, stabbing pains of memory. Every corner of the house held a ghost. The indentation on Julian's side of the bed, the coffee mug he favored still in the dish rack, the faint scent of his cologne on the collar of a blazer left behind in the closet. Each was a small torture. Sophia moved through her home like a wraith, the vibrant colors of her life bleached out, leaving only the stark skeletal framework of her heartbreak. Julian's lawyer, Robert Peterson, was as cold and efficient as his client. The initial letter arrived on thick cream-colored letterhead, its polite, sterile language outlining Julian's intentions with brutal clarity. He wanted a swift, uncomplicated divorce. He was offering a settlement that was, in Peterson's words, more than generous. To Sophia, it felt like an insult. He was trying to buy her silence, to put a price on 15 years of her life, her love, her sacrifices. She hired her own lawyer, a kind but firm woman named Eleanor Vance. The shared surname was a bitter irony not lost on Sophia, who warned her that Julian was playing hardball. "He wants to be free, Sophia, and he wants to do it as cleanly and cheaply as possible." Eleanor had explained, her eyes full of a weary sympathy that spoke of countless similar cases. "He's claiming that your lack of contribution to his career in recent years means the lion's share of the assets, including his firm partnership, are his alone. The accusation was a knife to the gut. The countless nights she'd spent hosting his colleagues and clients, charming them with her intelligence and grace. The years she'd managed their finances with meticulous care, allowing him the freedom to take professional risks. The unwavering emotional support that had been the bedrock of his ambition. All of it was now reframed as a lack of contribution. The true cruelty, however, came not from the lawyers, but from the digital world. A week after he left, Chloe Summers's social media profile, once private, suddenly became public. It was a calculated move, a digital victory lap. There they were, Julian and Chloe clinking champagne glasses on a rooftop bar, the city lights twinkling behind them like 1,000 tiny applauses for their betrayal. There was a picture of them on a weekend getaway to Nantucket. Julian's arm wrapped possessively around her, a genuine, unguarded smile on his face that Sophia hadn't seen in years. The caption read, "Finally found a man who isn't afraid of a little adventure." New beginnings. Love. Each post was a fresh wave of humiliation. Their shared friends, the couples they'd vacationed with and celebrated milestones with, were forced to choose sides. Most offered Sophia weak, pitying condolences before quietly unfollowing her, their allegiance shifting to the new shiny couple. Julian and Chloe were exciting. Sophia was a tragedy, a reminder of what could go wrong, and no one wanted that kind of unpleasantness on their social feed. The divorce proceedings dragged on for 6 agonizing months. Julian fought her on everything. He argued that the Victorian house, their dream home, should be sold immediately so he could access his equity to invest in his future. He contested her right to any portion of his pension. His cruelty was methodical. He was dismantling their shared past brick by brick, ensuring nothing was left for her to cling to. One afternoon, sorting through boxes in the attic, she found a portfolio of her old work from graduate school. It was filled with her research on the Florentine Renaissance, detailed analyses of obscure Baroque painters, and a half-finished thesis on the use of light in Caravaggio's work. She ran her fingers over the pages, the crisp paper a tangible link to a version of herself she had almost forgotten, a woman who was passionate, intelligent, and had a future of her own. A wave of profound loss washed over her, a grief not just for her marriage, but for the person she had allowed herself to stop being. The final court date arrived on a bleak November day. Sophia sat on one side of the sterile courtroom with Eleanor while Julian and Chloe sat on the other. Chloe was dressed in a sharp-tailored suit, her hand resting proprietorially on Julian's arm. She looked every bit the young, successful woman who had gotten everything she wanted. Julian refused to meet Sophia's eyes. The judge, a stern-faced man who had seen it all, finalized the decree. The house was to be sold. Sophia was awarded a settlement that was a fraction of what she deserved, enough to live on for a year or two if she was frugal, but not enough to rebuild a life. She was granted alimony for only 3 years, the judge agreeing with Peterson's argument that she was perfectly capable of re-entering the workforce. At 42, with a 15-year gap in her resume, the prospect felt like being asked to scale a sheer cliff face with no ropes. As they filed out of the courtroom, Julian finally stopped in front of her. Chloe stood a few feet away, watching them with a smug, triumphant smirk. "Sophia, He began, his voice faltering for the first time. Perhaps a flicker of guilt had finally penetrated his armor of self-justification. "I hope you can land on your feet. For what it's worth, I am sorry for the pain this has caused." It was the most pathetic absolution a man could offer. It wasn't an apology for his actions, only for her reaction to them. The condescension in his tone, the pity in his eyes, was the final indignity. Something inside Sophia, something that had been dormant for years, finally snapped. The grief and the helplessness receded, replaced by a cold, clear stream of anger. "Don't you dare pity me, Julian," she said, her voice low and steady, devoid of the tears he was likely expecting. "You didn't just cause me pain. You built your new life on the architecture of our ruin. You bulldozed 15 years of loyalty and love to build a monument to your own ego. Pity is for victims. I am not your victim. I am a survivor of your choices. And you will live with them. She turned and walked away, her back straight, leaving him standing there for the first time looking utterly speechless. Chloe's smirk had vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease. As Sophia walked out of the courthouse and into the cold, unforgiving city, she didn't feel defeated. She felt empty. But it was the emptiness of a cleared foundation, not a crater, an emptiness on which something new could eventually be built. The first step was leaving Boston and the ghosts it held behind for good. New York City was a brutal and indifferent balm. It didn't care about her heartbreak. Its relentless energy demanded her full attention, leaving little room for wallowing. Sophia sold the Victorian house in Boston, the closing a somber affair that felt like a funeral. With the meager proceeds from the sale and her settlement, she rented a small one-bedroom apartment in Greenwich Village, a neighborhood whose vibrant art scene felt like a tentative step back toward her old self. For the first few months, survival was the only goal. The city was overwhelmingly expensive, and the ghosts of her past life were replaced by the very real specter of financial ruin. The alimony felt less like a safety net and more like a ticking clock. She sent out dozens of resumes for curator positions at major museums, the Guggenheim, the Met, MoMA, but her 15-year employment gap was a glaring red flag. The rejection emails, when they came at all, were polite but firm. She was an artifact from another era in a field that was rapidly modernizing. Her best friend from college, Isabel, who worked in finance, was her lifeline. "Don't aim for the top right away," Soph Isabel advised over coffee one afternoon. "Get your foot in the door. Any door. Show them what you can do. Your passion hasn't expired, even if your resume has." Taking Isabel's advice, Sophia lowered her sights. She found a listing for an assistant archivist and researcher position at the Beaumont Gallery, a small but highly respected private gallery in Chelsea known for its collection of post-war European masters. It was a glorified administrative role, a world away from the senior curator position she'd once been on track for. The pay was abysmal, but it was a door. The gallery's owner, a formidable woman named Genevieve Beaumont, interviewed Sophia herself. Genevieve was in her late 70s with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through the carefully constructed professional facade Sophia had erected. "Your academic credentials are a decade and a half old." "Mrs. Reynolds," Genevieve said, her tone sharp but not unkind as she peered over her spectacles at Sophia's resume. "Why this job? This is grunt work. Cataloging research for acquisitions, handling provenance paperwork. It's not glamorous." "I'm aware," Sophia replied, her voice steady. "But I love the work. I've followed your gallery for years. Your acquisition of the early Gerhard Richter series was inspired. You saw the value before the market did. I want to be in a place that values the art over the hype. I'm not afraid of grunt work. I just want to be near the art again." Something in her honest, unvarnished answer seemed to resonate with the older woman. Genevieve hired her on a 3-month probationary basis. The work was exactly as described: tedious, meticulous, and largely invisible. Sophia spent her days in the gallery's chilly basement archive, surrounded by stacks of auction catalogs, artist biographies, and dusty provenance files. She cross-referenced sales records, digitized old slides, and wrote dry factual descriptions for the gallery's online database. Yet to her surprise, she felt a flicker of her old self returning. In the quiet solitude of the archives, surrounded by the stories of art and artists, she began to feel grounded. She was no longer just Julian's ex-wife. She was Sophia Reynolds' art historian. It was during her 2nd month that she first noticed him. He was a regular visitor to the gallery, but he wasn't like the other wealthy collectors who strode in with an air of entitlement, loudly discussing their portfolios. This man was different. He was tall and impeccably dressed in quiet, expensive suits, but he moved with an unassuming grace. He never spoke to the sales staff. He would simply enter, nod politely to the front desk, and spend an hour or two in silent contemplation of the artwork. He favored the more challenging, less commercial pieces, studying them with an intensity that fascinated Sophia. She learned from her colleagues that his name was Marcus Thorne. No one knew much about him other than that he was a significant though intensely private client. He purchased pieces occasionally, always through a discreet art consultant, never in person. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Sophia was upstairs in the main gallery helping to hang a new exhibition of Italian arte povera. She was on a ladder adjusting the lighting on a piece by Ioannis Kounellis when she heard a quiet voice from below. The interplay between the steel plate and the burlap sack is fascinating. One industrial and cold, the other organic and warm. A commentary on nature versus manufacturing. Sophia nearly lost her balance. She looked down to see Marcus Thorne standing there, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the artwork. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, more thinking aloud. I always thought Sophia found herself saying, her voice a little shaky from her perch on the ladder, that Kounellis was using the materials to explore a sort of modern-day alchemy, trying to transform mundane, poor materials into something with poetic, almost spiritual weight. He looked up at her, and his eyes, a deep shade of gray, registered a flicker of surprise and then genuine interest. That's a much better way of putting it. An alchemy of the ordinary. I like that. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't seem to care that she was just a staff member on a ladder. He was interested in her thought. "You have a good eye," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. "I'm just an archivist," she replied, climbing down the ladder and wiping her dusty hands on her trousers. "An archivist with a curator's insight," he corrected gently. He gave her a small, polite smile, nodded once more at the Kounellis piece, and then turned and walked out of the gallery as quietly as he had entered. The interaction was brief, lasting no more than 2 minutes, but it stayed with Sophia for the rest of the day. It was the first time in years that a stranger had seen her for her mind. He hadn't seen a jilted wife, a middle-aged woman starting over, or a low-level employee. He had seen her intellect. It was a small thing, a tiny seed of validation, but in the barren soil of her confidence, it felt like the beginning of a spring. For the first time since Julian had uttered those 5 fateful words, Sophia felt a genuine, unforced smile touch her lips. The seed of confidence planted by that brief encounter with Marcus Thorne began to sprout. Sophia poured her renewed energy into her work at the Beaumont Gallery with a ferocity she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just cataloging anymore. She was connecting dots, finding narratives hidden within the dusty archives. While researching the provenance of a minor painting by the French abstractionist Jean Fautrier, she uncovered a series of letters that suggested the painting was part of a lost triptych separated during the chaos of World War II. She spent weeks of her own time long after the gallery had closed cross-referencing shipping manifests and old family journals in digital archives across Europe. Her research was a masterclass in art historical detective work. Finally, she traced the other 2 pieces, one in a private collection in Zurich, the other misattributed in the storage vaults of a small museum in Brussels. She compiled her findings into a detailed 50-page report and with trembling hands left it on Genevieve Beaumont's desk. She didn't know if she was overstepping her bounds, if the owner of the gallery would be annoyed by the initiative of a mere archivist. 2 days later, Genevieve called her into her office. The report was on the desk, covered in handwritten notes. "This," Genevieve said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the cover page, "is the most brilliant piece of provenance research I have seen in 20 years. "How did you do this?" Sophia explained her process, her voice gaining confidence as she detailed the trail of clues. Genevieve listened intently, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. "I underestimated you, Mrs. Reynolds," Genevieve said when she was finished. "Effective immediately, your title is Head of Research and Archives. Your salary will be tripled. You will report directly to me. Your first project is to lead our efforts to acquire the other 2 Fautrier pieces and reunite the triptych. I want it as the centerpiece for our spring exhibition." Sophia was stunned. It was more than a promotion. It was a resurrection. The validation was so overwhelming she felt lightheaded. She had done this, on her own. Her mind, her skills, the very things Julian had implicitly devalued were now her greatest assets. Meanwhile, in Boston, Julian Vance's life was trending in the opposite direction. The thrill of his new relationship with Chloe had begun to curdle into a grim reality. Chloe's ambition was matched only by her expensive tastes. She wanted the penthouse apartment, the European sports car, the designer wardrobe. Julian, whose income was respectable but not stratospheric, found himself increasingly stretched thin. He had leveraged his share of the house sale on a risky real estate investment Chloe had pushed for, which was now underperforming. The generous settlement he'd resented giving Sophia now seemed like a pittance compared to Chloe's monthly credit card bills. Their relationship, once fueled by the illicit thrill of their affair, was now transactional. Their arguments were frequent and bitter, often about money. Chloe saw his financial struggles not as a shared problem, but as his personal failure. The possibilities and horizons he had once rhapsodized about now looked like a mountain of debt, and a partner who saw him as a means to an end. At work, his focus was shot. A major project he was leading came in over budget and behind schedule, earning him a stern reprimand from the senior partners. The brilliant rule-breaking man Chloe had supposedly fallen for was being ground down by the very life he had chosen. Back in New York, Sophia's life was blossoming. Her success with the Fautrier triptych sent ripples through the art world. The Beaumont Gallery's spring exhibition was a massive success, lauded in art journals and profiled in the New York Times. Sophia's name was mentioned as the brilliant researcher behind the discovery. Marcus Thorne began visiting the gallery more frequently. Their conversations, once rare, became a regular occurrence. He would seek her out ostensibly to ask a question about a particular piece, but their discussions would invariably drift to art theory, history, and philosophy. She learned that he was the founder and CEO of a hugely successful data analytics firm, Thorne Industries, but he spoke of his work with a detached air. His true passion was art. He was drawn to her deep, unpretentious knowledge and the quiet fire that lit up her eyes when she spoke about something she loved. She, in turn, was drawn to his incisive mind, his gentle demeanor, and the way he listened, truly listened to her ideas. There was an easy rapport between them, a meeting of minds that felt both exhilarating and deeply comforting. He never once asked about her past or her divorce. He was interested only in the woman standing before him. One evening, after a particularly engaging conversation about the sublime in the work of Mark Rothko, he hesitated at the gallery door. "Sophia," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I know this is forward, but there's a private concert at Carnegie Hall on Saturday. A performance of Beethoven's late string quartets. I have a box. Would you do me the honor of joining me?" Sophia's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a business proposition or a casual coffee. It was a date. A real one. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. "I would love that, Marcus," she said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. That Saturday, as she sat beside him in the velvet-lined box at Carnegie Hall, listening to the achingly beautiful and complex music, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. Marcus didn't try to impress her with his wealth or status. They simply shared the experience, their shoulders occasionally brushing, a silent communication passing between them. After the concert, he walked her back to her apartment building. Under the soft glow of the streetlights, he turned to her. "I haven't enjoyed an evening this much in a very long time, Sophia," he said, his gray eyes soft. "Neither have I," she confessed. He didn't lean in for a kiss. Instead, he gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Good night, Sophia." As she rode the elevator up to her small apartment, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her life was no longer defined by what she had lost. Julian had tried to convince her she was a garden left to go to seed, predictable and overgrown. But he was wrong. She wasn't overgrown. She was fallow. And in the heart of New York, away from the poison of his judgment, she was finally gloriously beginning to bloom again. The next year was a whirlwind of success and happiness that Sophia could never have imagined in the dark days following her divorce. Her role at the Beaumont Gallery expanded, and Genevieve began grooming her as a successor, taking her on acquisition trips to London, Paris, and Hong Kong. Sophia proved to have an uncanny instinct for the market, an academic's rigor, combined with a newly discovered business acumen. She was respected, admired, and financially independent for the first time in her adult life. Her relationship with Marcus deepened into a profound and loving partnership. It was a love built not on desperate need or youthful infatuation, but on a foundation of mutual respect, shared passions, and quiet understanding. He was her biggest champion, celebrating her professional triumphs with quiet pride. She in turn provided him with a sanctuary from the high-pressure world he inhabited, a space where he could be himself, not the titan of industry the world saw. He wasn't trying to recapture his youth or find a trophy. He was a man who had found his equal. 6 months into their relationship, he had taken her to a small, secluded beach in the Hamptons at sunset. There, with no fanfare or pretense, he told her he loved her and asked her to be his wife. He presented her not with a gaudy diamond, but with a simple, elegant ring featuring a rare cornflower blue sapphire the color of Genevieve Beaumont's eyes, a subtle nod to the place where their lives had first intersected. Sophia's yes was immediate and joyous. They decided to make their first official public appearance as an engaged couple at the annual Metropolitan Museum of Art's Conservation Gala, the most exclusive and high-profile philanthropic event in New York City. It was an evening where titans of finance, tech moguls, celebrities, and art world luminaries converged. For the event, Marcus had commissioned a gown for her from a famous designer. It was a masterpiece of deep emerald silk that shimmered under the light, cut in a classic, elegant style that highlighted her grace and confidence. A simple but breathtaking necklace of diamonds, a gift from Marcus, rested at her collarbone. As she looked at her reflection before they left their shared Fifth Avenue penthouse, a home filled with light art and laughter, she saw not a shadow of the heartbroken woman from Boston. She saw a woman who was powerful, radiant, and deeply loved. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked, coming up behind her. He was impossibly handsome in a bespoke tuxedo. He wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder, as they looked at their reflections together. "I am," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that resonated to her core. Their arrival at the Met was an event in itself. As they stepped out of the black town car, a flurry of camera flashes erupted. The name Marcus Thorne was whispered through the crowd of paparazzi, but the real question on everyone's lips was, who is the woman with him? She was a mystery, an elegant and unknown quantity on the arm of one of the world's most private billionaires. Sophia held her head high, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of Marcus's arm, utterly unfazed by the attention. Inside the gala was a dazzling spectacle of power and wealth. The great hall of the museum was filled with couture gowns, glittering jewels, and the confident hum of the global elite. Sophia, who had once felt her world shrink to the size of a suburban Victorian, now moved through this rarefied air with an easy grace. She wasn't intimidated. After all, she knew more about the art hanging on the walls around them than 99% of the people in the room. She wasn't just a billionaire's fiancée. She had earned her place here. They mingled, Marcus introducing her to senators, tech entrepreneurs, and celebrated artists. She spoke intelligently and charmingly, her expertise on art serving as a natural bridge in conversations. She wasn't just a beautiful accessory. She was a captivating presence in her own right, and Marcus watched her with undisguised adoration. This was her unveiling. Not just as Marcus Thorne's future wife, but as Sophia Reynolds, a woman reborn. The shame and humiliation Julian had inflicted upon her felt like a distant memory from someone else's life. She had not only survived, she had triumphed, building a life far grander and more fulfilling than the one that had been stolen from her. And as the orchestra began to play, and the dinner chimes rang, she had no idea that her past and present were about to collide in the most dramatic way imaginable. Julian Vance felt like an imposter. He stood near a massive floral arrangement, nursing a glass of overpriced champagne, the tuxedo he'd rented feeling tight and restrictive. Sterling and Vance Architects had purchased a single table at the Met Gala, a desperate, expensive attempt to network and stay relevant in a changing market. The firm was struggling, and so was Julian. His partnership dividends had been slashed, and his relationship with Chloe was a constant draining war of attrition. She was here tonight, currently across the room, laughing a little too loudly with a younger real estate developer. Chloe had insisted they attend. To her, this evening wasn't about business. It was about being seen. It was about populating her Instagram feed with proof that she had arrived. She wore a garish, bright fuchsia dress that was more expensive than Julian's monthly mortgage payment on the cramped condo they now shared. He watched her, and for the first time he felt nothing but a hollow emptiness. The vibrant, exciting woman he had left his life for had revealed herself to be a shallow, demanding mannequin interested only in the status he could provide, a status that was rapidly diminishing. He scanned the cavernous hall, a sea of faces he didn't know, feeling a profound sense of alienation. His life in Boston, the respect of his peers, the quiet comfort of his home, he had torched it all for this. For a rented suit and a partner who looked at him with perpetual disappointment. A bitter regret, an emotion he had long suppressed, began to rise in his throat like bile. And then he saw her. Across the room, bathed in the soft golden light of a chandelier, stood a woman in an emerald silk gown. She was laughing, her head tilted back slightly, a cascade of diamonds glittering at her throat. There was something familiar about her posture, the elegant line of her neck. As she turned her head, her profile came into view, and the champagne glass in Julian's hand trembled. It was Sophia. But it wasn't the Sophia he knew. It wasn't the quiet, unassuming wife in sensible cardigans he had left behind. This woman was luminous. She radiated a confidence and poise that was breathtaking. She was captivating. He watched mesmerized as the man beside her, a tall, distinguished figure, leaned in and whispered something in her ear, his touch on the small of her back both gentle and possessive. The man was Marcus Thorne. Even Julian, in his diminished world, knew who Marcus Thorne was, a legend in the tech world, a genuine billionaire, a man whose influence quietly shaped global markets. The blood drained from Julian's face. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The cacophony of the gala, the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses faded into a dull roaring static in his ears. It was as if the world had suddenly switched to slow motion. Sophia, his Sophia. The woman he had discarded as boring and predictable was standing there on the arm of Marcus Thorne, looking like she owned the very room he felt so out of place in. He felt a primal, illogical surge of possessiveness. What is she doing with him? The absurdity of the question didn't even register. He had to talk to her. He had to understand. He started moving through the crowd, his movements clumsy, jostling a waiter, and ignoring the annoyed glances he received. He reached them just as Marcus was being pulled away by a colleague. Sophia was left standing alone for a moment, observing a nearby Rodin sculpture. This was his chance. "Sophia," he said, his voice coming out as a hoarse croak. She turned slowly, her expression one of polite neutrality, the kind one reserves for a stranger asking for directions. Then her eyes focused on him, and a flicker of recognition appeared, followed by nothing. No anger, no sadness, no shock. Just a cool, placid calm. It was 1,000 times more devastating than any outburst would have been. "Julian," she said, her voice even and smooth. "What a surprise to see you here. Sophia, you look—" He fumbled for words, his mind blanking. "Incredible." "Thank you," she said simply, her gaze already starting to drift away as if looking for someone more interesting. "I don't understand." He blurted out, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "You're with Marcus Thorne." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "We're engaged, actually." Engaged. The word hit him like a physical punch. He had envisioned her life after him as a sad, lonely affair. Maybe she'd have gotten a quiet job at a library. Maybe she'd be living in a small apartment, regretting the life she'd lost. This reality, This glorious, triumphant reality was something his ego could not process. But how he stammered like a fool. "I went back to work," she said, her tone carrying a hint of amusement. "I remembered who I was before I dedicated 15 years of my life to supporting your career. It turns out I'm quite good at it." Just then Chloe arrived, her fuchsia dress an assault on the eyes. "Julian, there you are. Who is this?" she asked, looking Sophia up and down with a dismissive air. Before Julian could answer, Sophia's eyes met Chloe's. The cool calm remained, but now it was edged with steel. She didn't acknowledge Chloe's question. She simply looked at her, then back at Julian, a silent, damning assessment of the choice he had made. In that single glance, she made Chloe look cheap, loud, and utterly insignificant. Marcus returned to her side, his presence alone, a force field of power and influence. He slipped his arm around Sophia's waist, his eyes glancing at Julian with polite disinterest. "Everything all right, my love?" he asked Sophia, his voice a low rumble of concern. "Perfectly," Sophia replied, turning her back on Julian and Chloe completely. She placed a hand on Marcus's chest. "Darling, I was just telling an old acquaintance from Boston how lovely the evening is." An old acquaintance. The words were a final, brutal severance. He wasn't her ex-husband, the man who had shared her bed for 15 years. He was just a footnote from a past she had moved on from. As Sophia and Marcus walked away, blending seamlessly back into the glittering crowd, Julian stood frozen in place. Chloe started complaining beside him, her voice a shrill, annoying buzz. He didn't hear her. He was watching Sophia. He was watching the masterpiece he had thrown away, the woman he had been too blind and too arrogant to see. He had traded a priceless work of art for a cheap, flashy print. And he was left standing there, a mannequin among men, hollowed out by the crushing weight of his catastrophic mistake. The months following the Met Gala were a slow, agonizing unraveling for Julian Vance. The image of Sophia, radiant and untouchable, on the arm of Marcus Thorne was seared into his memory. It became the backdrop to every failure, every argument, every new disappointment. It was the ghost at the feast of his miserable life. The encounter had a profound effect on Chloe as well. Seeing Sophia so clearly inhabiting a world of wealth and class that Chloe could only aspire to broke something in her. The man she had attached herself to was revealed not as a stepping stone but as a sinking one. Her contempt for Julian, once a simmering undertone, became open and venomous. She mocked his declining income, his lack of connections, his failure to be the powerful man she thought he was. Their fights escalated, the thin veneer of passion stripped away to reveal the ugly transactional core of their relationship. The end came 6 months after the gala, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Julian came home to their condo to find Chloe's closets empty and a note on the kitchen counter. She had left him for the real estate developer she had been talking to at the gala. The note didn't even say goodbye. It was just a list of things she considered hers that she would be sending movers for. Professionally, Julian's world was also crumbling. His lack of focus and souring demeanor had not gone unnoticed at the firm. When a new round of layoffs was announced, his name was at the top of the list. At 48 years old, Julian Vance, once a promising senior architect, was unemployed, deeply in debt, and utterly alone. He was forced to sell the condo at a loss and move into a small, characterless apartment on the outskirts of the city. He was a man adrift, haunted by the echoes of a life he had single-handedly destroyed. Sophia's life, by contrast, continued its spectacular ascent. She and Marcus were married in a small private ceremony at their estate in Tuscany, surrounded by a close circle of friends and family. Genevieve Beaumont, frail but beaming, was her matron of honor. Sophia, in a simple but exquisitely tailored white dress, looked breathtakingly happy. Her career soared. With Marcus's backing and her own sharp intellect, she left the Beaumont Gallery to start the Reynolds Thorne Foundation for the Arts, a philanthropic organization dedicated to funding emerging artists and repatriating stolen works of art. She became one of the most respected and influential figures in the art world, not because she was a billionaire's bride, but because of her genuine passion, deep knowledge, and unwavering integrity. She traveled the world, spoke at conferences, and curated exhibitions that were celebrated for their vision and intelligence. She had found not just a new life, but her true calling. She rarely thought of Julian. When she did, it was with a distant, detached pity. He was a chapter from a book she had finished long ago. Her anger had dissipated, leaving behind only the quiet wisdom that sometimes the most painful endings are the doorways to the most beautiful beginnings. Her life with Marcus was one of true partnership. They challenged each other, supported each other, and built a shared world rich with love, art, and purpose. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 5 years after he had left her, Julian was walking through downtown Boston. He was on his way to an interview for a low-level drafting position at a small, uninspired firm, the only interview he'd been able to get in months. As he passed a high-end newsstand, his eyes were drawn to the cover of a magazine. It was Forbes, and on the cover was Sophia. She was standing in front of a stunning sculpture, her expression confident and serene. The headline read, "Sophia Reynolds, the new face of art philanthropy. How the Billionaire's Bride is changing the world, one masterpiece at a time." Julian stopped dead on the sidewalk, the city's hustle and bustle fading away. He stared at the photograph, at the woman he had called boring, unadventurous, and predictable. He had traded her for a fleeting thrill for a younger model, believing he was upgrading his life. He had been so obsessed with the superficial currency of youth and excitement that he had failed to see the true immeasurable value of the woman beside him, her loyalty, her brilliance, her quiet strength. He had cashed in a fortune for a handful of trinkets. He finally understood. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the best part of himself. His punishment wasn't poverty or loneliness. It was the crushing eternal knowledge of what he had thrown away and the understanding that he would spend the rest of his life as a forgotten footnote in the magnificent story of hers. He bought the magazine, and as he walked to his dead-end interview, he began to read about the incredible world she had built, a world he had once been invited to share, but had been too much of a fool to appreciate. In the end, this isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about value. Julian Vance saw his wife's worth in terms of what she did for him, and when he thought he could get more elsewhere, he left. He never understood that Sophia's true value was not in her role as a wife, but in the incredible person she was. When she was finally free of his judgment, she was able to invest in herself, and her worth grew beyond anything he could have ever imagined. It's a powerful reminder that our value isn't determined by who we are to someone else, but by who we are to ourselves. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what you're truly made of. What did you think of Sophia's incredible transformation? Have you ever seen someone turn a devastating setback into their greatest victory? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you were moved by this story, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of trial and triumph. Thank you for listening. Thank you for